This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 5 of Here's How. On this show, I'll be talking about freedom of speech on the internet, how Ireland is judged to be a country almost free of corruption, and what we can do about Dáil reform.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
We've got a serious problem with Garda corruption. But corruption in Ireland doesn't work like corruption in other countries. In fact, you might think that corruption in Ireland hardly happens at all. There is an international anti-corruption group called Transparency International, and they publish a corruption index every year, and by the look of it, Ireland isn't doing too badly. They compare 175 countries, and last year Ireland came in at number 17. That doesn't sound too bad. We're in the least corrupt 10% of countries. I'll put links for all these sources on the webpage for this episode, by the way. But let's look at that index more closely. It's an index of perceptions of corruption that they publish. They could hardly do anything else. They couldn't really go around and do a survey of all the corrupt people. So they do a survey of everybody and see if people have run into corruption. Now, I've been to places like Cuba, Southeast Asia and the former Soviet Union, and there low-level corruption is pretty standard practice. If you go to a government office to get a form stamped or to get a certificate for something, it's pretty standard to be told that you have to take a seat and wait. How long do you have to wait? You have to wait long enough for you to realize that you have to pay the official working there a bribe if you want to stop waiting. In those countries, this happens all the time. If you want to pass a test, if you want to not have your taxes audited, or if you want a health inspector to approve your restaurant, then you have to pay a bribe. In my entire life, I've come across that type of thing happening in Ireland maybe once or twice. So when Irish people are asked by Transparency International whether they have personal experience of corruption, most people will say no, and they're right. And Ireland scores very well on that index as a result. But there are different types of corruption, types that are harder to measure, but they still are very serious. This is the type of corruption that is, I think, endemic in Ireland. We don't know how much of it is going on, but all the indications are that the situation is not good. It's more than a decade since the Morris Tribunal, the tribunal investigating Garda corruption in Donegal, which found that Gardaí were, and this is a quote, which found that Gardaí were in a state of disarray with low morale, poor discipline, lack of oversight, and a culture of silence. A couple of Gardaí in Donegal were fired, but despite clear evidence of wrongdoing, including fabricating evidence and perjury, not one Garda has been convicted of many of the crimes that were committed. But most seriously of all, when it came to the Morris Tribunal, one Garda named Martin Leonard gave evidence. He wasn't involved in criminality in himself, but he admitted that he had witnessed other Gardaí doing things like forging statements, and he was asked why he didn't report it. He was a Garda after all. He should have arrested them and charged them, that's his job. But he said, you don't hang your own. In that culture, the casual criminality is the real scandal. There will always be bent coppers. It happens, everywhere. But when all the other coppers come to see that as normal, when it is unthinkable for them to enforce the law, that's to say, do their job, when it's unthinkable for them to enforce the law on their colleagues, that is when it goes beyond the case of a few bent coppers and becomes institutionalized corruption. Then it's not the individuals that are corrupt, it's the entire force. And there was the penalty point scam. When questions were first raised by TDs like Claire Daly, they were dismissed. They were told that it was normal for discretion to be applied, that there was bound to be the odd instance where somebody made the wrong call. But this wasn't the odd case. This was corruption on an industrial scale. And don't imagine that this was done out of any misplaced sense of kindness. Anyone who's read The Godfather will know how mafia dons go around giving out favours, but all those favours come with strings attached. If you take the favour, you're in their debt, which is where they want you to be. This was the strategy with Luke Ming Flanagan. He wasn't a wet week in the Dáil when a senior Garda bumped into him, conveniently, and knew about the points on his licence, conveniently, and offered to have them fixed, conveniently. And like a fool, Flanagan agreed, conveniently. And as soon as Flanagan started giving them trouble, the story of those penalty points ended up in the lap of a friendly journalist, undercutting Flanagan's credibility, conveniently. And don't forget what happened when the new commissioner, Noreen O'Sullivan, ordered that the system be cleaned up, and all of the cancelling of penalty points be centralised in one supposedly independent office. Many senior Gardaí continued merrily cancelling penalty points as it suited them in the face of a direct order to stop. That is some brazen action. They knew they were going to get caught. The system records who cancelled the points. There had been huge publicity. They had been ordered to stop by the Guard Commissioner, no less, and they did it anyway. Make no mistake, these bulldogs didn't do that for the sake of the penalty points in question. They were cocking their legs and marking their territory and sending a message that they would do what they'd liked. And not one of them has been disciplined or fired, let alone arrested and charged with abuse of office. This has a new relevance now because of a Supreme Court ruling on the 16th of April. When Gardaí are doing their job, gathering evidence for use in courts, there are minimum standards that they're supposed to comply with. They can't search your house without a warrant. They must allow you to access to a lawyer if you're being questioned. The courts have traditionally enforced these rights down the years by saying that if they get evidence illegally, they can't use it in court. Sometimes that can be frustrating because they might have evidence against someone but they can't use it and that person gets off. But mostly it means that the Gardaí stick to the rules because they have an incentive to do so. Otherwise they can't use the evidence, at least not if they get caught. Well, on the 16th of April, a case came before the Supreme Court where someone was illegally detained and questioned. Previously, anything that somebody says in such circumstances could not be used in evidence against them. That's the normal situation in most democracies. Now our Supreme Court has changed the rules. If the Gardaí break the rules of evidence, the Supreme Court has said, if they do an illegal search, if they detain someone illegally, the evidence they collect then can still be used in court as long as the Gardaí thought that they weren't breaking the rules. The Supreme Court has said that if the Gardaí thought in good faith that they were complying with the rules of evidence, then that's enough. This is a huge shift. Before, any legal argument on this would be a dispute about facts. Did such a person do such a thing? Did such a thing happen or did it not? Was there a search warrant? Was somebody read their rights? Was somebody granted access to a lawyer? And so on. Now, what happened doesn't matter. The thing that matters now is what the Gardaí thought. If they thought they were following the rules of evidence, then they were following them. Happenings in the real world are tangible and verifiable. People can witness them and independently measure their results. Thoughts, on the other hand, are totally inaccessible to anyone except the thinker. There is no way to evaluate them other than to believe what the person tells you they were thinking. If a Garda witness for the prosecution says he thought one thing, the defence can't possibly call another witness to say that he thought something else. This is a very serious weakening in the rights of the individual against the state. I should say that this judgment was by the narrowest possible majority, 4 votes to 3 amongst the judges on the Supreme Court, and the 3 dissenting judges were highly critical of the judgment, Justice Adrian Hardiman said, "I consider it utterly unwise, to use no stronger word, to grant to the Gardaí in that context the effective immunity from judicial oversight which this case does." He's right. This is a green light for corrupt Gardaí to do what they want, and then cross their fingers and say, but sure, I thought that was the way I was supposed to do it. He was right, but he was in a minority. There's a lot wrong with the Garda Síochána, and the solution is to tighten up and enforce the rules, not to let them get even slacker.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Adrian Weckler is the technology correspondent of the Irish Independent, and he joins me on the line now. Adrian, you wrote an article a while back that was headlined, "My tweet may annoy you, but it shouldn't land me in jail." How on earth could a tweet land me in jail?
Well, the context here is there are two proposed bits of legislation to go before the Dáil, both from members of the Labour Parliamentary Party, one from Pat Rabbitte and the other from Senator Lorraine Higgins. And both in different ways are seeking to introduce new criminal sanctions for essentially what amounts to online trolling. So in the case of the bill from Pat Rabbitte, it says that a person who sends a message or other matter that is offensive or indecent, obscene or menacing is guilty of an offence. And his bill would also criminalise annoyance, inconvenience or needless anxiety to another persistently without reasonable cause. In the case of Lorraine Higgins, it says that a person who persistently shares malicious electronic communications regarding another shall be guilty of an offence. And her definition of malicious here is where it intentionally or recklessly causes alarm, distress or harm to the other. Now, the problem here is we're getting into an area where we're trying to criminalize general concepts of hurt. So the key words in these proposed laws are words like alarm or distress or annoyance. Now, sometimes they're qualified, but in general, they leave interpretation wide open. And, you know, you're talking about a situation here where overnight, thousands of people, probably teenagers, if we're being honest, could really find themselves on the sharp end of the law for essentially what are issues of just bad human behaviour, but issues that we've always stopped short of criminalising.
Is there a sense here that something that's menacing or threatening, that's legally well defined, and somebody can look at something and there can't really be two opinions as to whether, you know, somebody is threatening somebody, but when you come to talk about alarm and distress, that's really internal to the victim, and who's to say what would alarm or distress someone?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a valid point. I mean, we do already have laws that try to prevent the more serious online bad behaviour, such as we obviously have defamation acts. We also have anti-harassment laws, particularly the 1997 Offences Against the Person Act, and that essentially allows guards or prosecutors to go after someone who is harassing somebody else by any means, and that includes online. It's not hard to see the intent of what both Pat Rabbitte and Lorraine Higgins are trying to do here. They're trying to just put something on the table, because there is a problem here. There is definitely a problem with a coarsening of behaviour online and people sneering at each other and turning it into a contact sport. You know, who can make the snarkiest, snidest remark about an ideological opponent. Is
there any reason why behaviour online should be any more illegal than offline? If somebody did something offline, why should the law be different online? Well,
that's the point I'm trying to raise, I suppose, that we need to be very, very careful about the unforeseen consequences. Just because we have lots of stories and lots of headlines about people being hurt by stuff they read online, and in many cases genuinely distressed, and in some cases causes great damage. There are definitely incidences where kids, for example, have taken it very, very badly. It's caused self-harm, etc. And I think that's what, particularly with Senator Lorraine Higgins, that's what she's trying to get at. But that doesn't necessarily make for good law.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's perhaps a degree why they're trying to jump on a bandwagon and get a headline for the popular cause of the day?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I can understand why people might jump to that conclusion. In the case of Senator Lorraine Higgins, she has been fairly open about having been trolled badly herself. In the case of Pat Rabbitte, former Minister for Communications, whatever people may think about him, I do remember 2 years ago, he on matter of principle, he faced down at the time populist calls to ban or force internet providers here to block adult content for home broadband connections, and that would have been a real easy win with the tabloids.
Yeah, it's worth saying that the British, David Cameron in particular, did bring in that limitation on home broadband porn, and it fell flat on its face.
But his motivation when he was bringing it in, and the whole 6-month period around that, was definitely a PR win with Middle England and the Daily Mail readers, and it would have been quite easy for a Minister of Communications here at the time, with that going on, to get in behind that. I can think of one of the other two politicians who might.
Adrian, is there maybe a counterpoint to be put that the internet magnifies things to such a degree that, given that one person shouting abuse at you in the street is one thing, 1,000 people, or in some cases maybe 1 million people abusing you on Twitter, is that same thing enormously magnified? If we have that magnification effect, do we have to have stricter codes of conduct?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question about it. There is a problem. We do have a coarsening of behaviour. I mean, just in the last 24 hours, Twitter itself has introduced a new feature set where it will try to filter out abuse at the point of posting. The marriage referendum is a very good example. If 1,000 people on the no side or 1,000 people on the yes side all target a high-profile campaigner on each side and all bombard them with remarks, what do we do about those people? Now, this applies equally to the no side and the yes side. Mm-hmm. What do we do as a matter? I mean, do we arrest them? Or ultimately, do we just tell them to behave better?
Adrian Weckler from the Irish Independent, thank you very much.
Make your view heard. Record your own contribution and email it to podcast@here'show.ie. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
I'm joined on the line now by Laura Lee. Laura, could you describe yourself professionally?
Certainly. I'm an escort, dominatrix, writer and sex workers' rights campaigner.
Okay, Laura, and I got in touch with you because you have said publicly that you're planning to take a case against the government in the north because they're planning to bring in a legislation that would criminalise the customers of sex workers. Similar legislation is actually planned in the south. Can you tell me what the basis for that is?
Certainly. The case I'm mounting in the north of Ireland can only go ahead once the law has come into effect, so that's after the 1st of June. And we will start our challenge in the High Court, through to the Supreme Court, and hopefully through to Strasbourg to have it heard at European level for once and all. In the south, I plan on mounting a similar challenge, and that will be a Supreme Court constitutional law challenge. And the basis of both actions will be that the law is in contravention of several of our human rights.
Specifically?
Well, we're looking at several grounds. It's early days yet. Specifically, we're looking at, the right to life, the right to privacy, the right to freedom from degrading treatment, the right to earn a living. There are several grounds.
Okay. I suppose somebody answering that would argue that there's a whole range of provisions that restrict people's actions with the view of protecting them. Isn't prohibiting prostitution, doesn't it fit in line with that?
No, it doesn't, because I'm firmly of the belief that when two consenting adults get together behind closed doors to have sex, whether money changes hands or not, it is none of the state's business and they have no right to intervene. The only time the state has the right to intervene is when harm occurs, and we can debate the definition of harm all day.
Well, tell me what you would see as harm.
So I would see coercion, drug addiction, any kind of violence, any small element of trafficking, which has been huge in the discourse around this debate and greatly exaggerated by abolitionists. Any kind of pimping that's going on, that's the girl is not getting the majority of the money for herself. There's many elements to that.
Okay. And in terms of pimping, is it really possible to have a regime where prostitution is legal, but pimping does not exist?
Well, if you look at New Zealand, they decriminalised the laws around prostitution so that the women can work together for safety in brothels. And actually, New Zealand was the site of the first successful case of a sex worker suing her employer. So that's where we want to get to, is a decriminalised state where sex workers are afforded labour rights the same as any other industry. Right now, the situation in Ireland is absolutely farcical. This law is being put forward as something that's going to keep us safe, and that's, I'm afraid, complete bunkum. At the moment, if two women work together in an apartment in the Republic of Ireland, they can both be arrested and prosecuted for pimping from one another, while still being deemed vulnerable victims by the state. And what's more, the money can be taken off them by the Gardaí and awarded to various rescue organisations. Now, if that's how we take care of vulnerable women, I'd hate to see how we take care of the Irish Women's Institution.
I can understand that, you can portray a situation of sex workers working in a reasonably empowered way where they have power over their own lives. But isn't it true that for the great majority of prostitution in Europe, and, maybe people would have experience of going to Southeast Asia and seeing bar girls working there, isn't the way that industry necessarily operates with a premium on quite young girls, maybe teenagers, aren't they inherently more exploitable by older males?
Well, first of all, this debate isn't about Asia or around the world, it's about Ireland. And if you're asking me about Ireland, I have 22 years experience in the industry, and the vast majority are not young girls being exploited by older males at all. In fact, we know that 70% of sex workers in Ireland are actually mothers putting food on the table for their children in a recession. Again, people like Ruhama and Turn Off the Red Light will repeatedly tell you that the vast majority of sex workers are trafficked and they're moved from brothel to brothel, etc. That's not true. Do
you have personal experience of that?
Yes, I do.
Can you maybe give a specific?
Certainly. I worked in the Republic of Ireland for very many years. I worked at every level in the industry, from Burlington Road to massage parlours, right up to elite escort agencies. And I can tell you right now, I never came across one victim of trafficking. The reason the abolitionist groups are doing that is because it ensures their continued funding and the continued necessity for their existence. So they've a vested interest in thwarting this debate, which they've tried to do from the offset.
I understand. I can see that Ruhama, which is actually the Sisters of Mercy under another name, as I understand it, may have an interest in preserving their own existence. But I have travelled in Southeast Asia, and I must say it was horrendous. Young teenage girls in very, very vulnerable situations, clearly being deeply exploited, and it seems to me that that's an inherent part of, perhaps not all, but a lot of prostitution, because there is greater demand for younger girls and they are more easy to exploit.
Again, this debate is not on Asia, it's on Ireland. And I wouldn't say there's greater demand for younger girls at all. I'm now in my early 40s and I've never been busier. And Ruhama can set themselves up as the great rescuers of sex workers when they apologise and indeed compensate the victims of the Magdalen laundries like they've been repeatedly requested to do.
Okay, Laura Lee, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
And on the line from Berlin, I've got Santosh Srinivasan of Transparency International. Santosh, what exactly is Transparency International?
Transparency International is an international coalition of anti-corruption watchdog organizations within International Secretariat based in Berlin. We're primarily a coalition of organizations that fight corruption around the world.
That sounds like an excellent thing to be doing. It has echoes of Amnesty International. When were you founded?
We were founded in 1993, based first here out of Berlin, where the Secretariat is today. But today we have chapters in almost 100 countries around the world.
Okay. The reason that I was interested in speaking to you is because I was seeing in your 2014 annual report that Ireland is number 17 out of 175 countries. That's to say in the top 10% of least corrupt countries in the world. Mm-hmm. How do you figure that out?
That is correct. So the report or research product that you're referring to is called the Corruption Perceptions Index. As the name suggests, it's an index of perceived levels of public sector corruption around the world.
The reason I wanted to take you up on that, and you mentioned perceptions of corruption in the public sector. I think in Ireland, a lot of people will be very surprised to hear themselves in the top 10% least corrupt countries in the world. Is it possible that, without undermining your work at all, that you're measuring something slightly different? Because if you go to, maybe countries in Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union or Southeast Asia, anybody who's looking for a driving license or a health certificate for the restaurant or something could routinely expect to have to pay a bribe in order to get that. That's very unusual in Ireland. Mm-hmm. So the average Irish person would rightfully answer a question on that, saying that they very rarely encounter that type of corruption. But that doesn't mean that there isn't high-level corruption that's damaging the economy and damaging society.
Absolutely. Your statement is spot on. As you just characterized it, corruption is an extremely complex issue. And the Corruption Perceptions Index, as the name states, is is a perceived score of public sector corruption. And what the CPI score provides is a reflection on the general state of corruption as faced by ordinary people as well as businesses in a country.
Would it be fair to say that that's essentially an opinion poll?
It is an opinion poll, but not of ordinary citizens, but opinion poll of experts and business executives.
I understand, but if, for example, quietly behind the scenes, planning permission is given for a supermarket that should not have been given because large bribes have been paid, that won't necessarily show up in your index. Is that correct?
Indeed, yeah. So what would show up on this index is basically as you said, bribery given out to public officials, or if there is some kind of embezzlement of funds or kickbacks in public procurement processes and such. But the Corruption Perceptions Index may not capture well issues related to grant corruption or issues related to financial secrecy and matters like that, which are also corrupt activities.
Santosh Srinivasan from Transparency International in Berlin, thank you very much for speaking to me.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
A couple of weeks back, Professor David Farrell, the Chair of Politics at UCD, wrote 5 points for improving politics in Ireland. Roughly, they were to elect the Ceann Comhairle by secret ballot and the Comhairle of the Seanad as well, to appoint the next Ceann Comhairle after the next election to implement root and branch review of Dáil standing orders, to elect chairs of committees by secret ballot, and to persuade all political parties to relax the use of parliamentary whips, and to allow the Oireachtas working groups to call the Taoiseach before them to answer questions. Professor David Farrell joins me on the line now. Thank you for that. There are some things in there I think that are very sensible, but one that struck out at me straight away was electing the Ceann Comhairle and the Cathaoirleach of the Seanad by secret ballot. I elect my TD, I expect to know what they're up to. Why should TDs be allowed to vote in secret?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's people have sort of made that point. I think the issue here is that we're trying to have a situation where the Dáil, let's talk about the Seanad separately if we want to, but let's just focus on the Dáil where the real things happen, should be able to have a greater degree of accountability over the government. And all of those points and more besides are trying to address the problem that we have, which is our very weak Dáil, so it doesn't hold the government properly to account. And one of the ways in which we can try and address that is to have the office of the Ceann Comhairle given much greater stature within the Dáil, much greater legitimacy in the office holder of that position. And the reason we don't have that, many of us would argue, is because in effect, in normal times at least, the Ceann Comhairle is the gift of the Taoiseach of the day.
Do you think it would be practically possible to?
The individual might be when they're in office, they're still always going to be tainted by that fact that the Taoiseach of the day put them there.
Do you think it would be practically possible to keep that voting secret?
You can never say everything is going to be absolutely shipshape and perfect. But if you were able to set it up so that, at least in theory, every one of the 158, as they're going to be, members of the Dáil in the future would be allowed to vote for their preferred candidate. It's up to them if they want to later on volunteer who they voted for, but they can always lie. There's no way of proving for sure whether they actually voted one way or the other, because it's private, it's a secret ballot. And only through that means can you at least have a fair chance that an independent voice might emerge.
Right. I'm struck by the comparison of voting of like county councillors. There's about 1,000 councillors get votes in the Seanad elections. They tend to vote very, very, very strictly along party lines. Is there any reason to think that would change?
There's no reason to think that it could change terribly radically. You may still find that the same sort of individuals get into the position, but once they're there, they can say, I was elected by my peers in a secret ballot, in a fair ballot, and anyone could have won that ballot. It's very different from effectively the situation where I was put there because Enda Kenny wanted me to be in that position.
It's in the gift of the Taoiseach.
In effect, what we have today.
Looking back at the people who actually made it to Ceann Comhairle, and as you said, there mightn't be a change in the personnel, more in the motivation, but the actual quality of the people who've been elected as Ceann Comhairle, we've got Sean Barrett at the moment, who I think certainly the opposition wouldn't have very much confidence in. He's had several scrapes with them. A little bit before that, we had John O'Donoghue again, who didn't seem terribly well suited to the job, and we've all seen the Charlie series and seen a rehash of Sean Doherty, who was made Cathaoirleach of the Seanad. Are they really the people who should be looking after Dáil reform?
But you see, that's the point I'm getting at, because if they're the gift of the Taoiseach of the day, then the Taoiseach of the day is going to put somebody in there for whatever motivation they might want. It might be to park somebody who's a bit of an embarrassment, or it might be to make a favour for somebody. And the person who's in the office might be there for that sort of reason. It's very different from a situation where these people will have to compete for that role. And then, as I said, it should be part of a mix of other things, so that it should be part of then the person who's in that role being given a mandate to actually look at root and branch reviews of standing orders with a view to giving the Dáil much greater say over its own agenda. I don't see these as just standalone issues. I think you have to look at it as a mix of items together.
Okay, and one of the reforms that might come out of that you mentioned is relaxing the use of parliamentary whips, so that aside from on money bills, on confidence votes that the government would fall, TDs would more or less be allowed to vote as they like. You're obviously a professor of politics. I, and probably everybody listening to this, have a deep interest in politics, but I'm very uneasy with that because I think most people are what might be called low information voters. They don't know an awful lot about the people who they're asked to vote for. But if you put Fianna Fáil or the Socialist Party or Fine Gael or Sinn Féin beside their name, then people have a much greater understanding of how they think that person will behave in the Dáil. If you take away the whips, doesn't that level of understanding, especially from low information voters, isn't that diminished?
There is quite a debate about to what extent there is scope to relax the whip, and in fact, when I raised that issue in another forum in the politicalreform.ie blog, I made the suggestion that we could look at relaxing the whip. I was lambasted by several of my other political science colleagues as being naive on this matter. So there are differing views about it. I mean, what I would be suggesting isn't quite the way you've portrayed it there. I'd be saying that, yeah, there should be the whip on money-related matters because they're confidence issues in a vote in the Dáil. But I would also say that specific manifesto proposals would also be ones where one would imagine the whip should still apply for the reason that lies behind your question. If I vote for, let's say, Sinn Féin in the next election on the basis in part of the policies of that party, I'd like to think that the TDs of Sinn Féin are going to vote in a way that's consistent with the party. However, if other issues emerge in the course of a parliament that may not have been anticipated in the manifesto, then I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be possible for a Dáil deputy to decide on the basis of their conscience how they want to vote on that matter.
And one other thing just on that, I wonder, is it legally possible? Because a political party is a private organisation. We allow for freedom of association. So if that association, that political party, says one of the conditions of membership is you vote in this way, you're free to vote another way if you want, but that means you get thrown out. That's essentially how the whip works. Yeah. Politicians, I think, have discovered in the main it is in their interests to be in parties, and that's why the whip system works. It has no force of law, does it?
That's absolutely correct, and it's exactly as you set it out there. So it's as much a badge of convenience for TDs to be able to get on with the things they want to get on with and not worry too much about being attacked by their constituents because they're not voting a way that their constituents want them to vote, that they can then hide behind the party whip and say, sorry folks, this was the way the party required us to vote. So it's as much about changing the culture of the TDs as well, because part of what these proposals are about is to try and get TDs to recognise that they are legislators as well as public representatives. So it's not just representing the interests of the constituents, it's also legislating in the Dáil, which means focusing on their legislative role and sometimes taking stances that may be inconvenient.
One last question then, David. In order to get TDs to focus more on being legislators, would it be a good idea for the Cabinet to no longer be members of the Dáil?
I think that is definitely something worth considering now. That's an area where you're moving into the realm of constitutional reform, and my proposals were very much focused on what I would say are relatively quick fixes that could be done immediately in the next Dáil. Whereas you would have to change the constitution to, pretty radically to allow for the possibility of ministers to be appointed from outside the Dáil, or for Dáil deputies, if they're made minister, to have to resign their Dáil seat, both of which were proposals by the Irish Constitutional Convention, both of which were rejected by this government. So they have been voiced as ideas, but the government have chosen to reject them. And as you probably know, we're out of step, to a degree even out of step with the United Kingdom, but certainly out of step with most everywhere else in Europe in that regard, where there is scope to bring in talent from outside politics.
David Farrell, Professor of Politics at UCD, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
And that's episode 5 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 23rd of April 2015. References for facts and figures that I mentioned in the show are listed in the page for this episode on the website. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give us a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter, and of course subscribe to the show. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. And you can do all of that right from www.here'show.ie. And you can go down the pub and meet real people and tell them how great the podcast is without ever touching your computer. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.